I'm going to talk about Zero Carbon Britain Rethinking the Future, which is a report that we launched last year from the Centre for Alternative Technology, or in Welsh, which is, we're based in Wales, Canolfan y Dechnoleg Amgen. I was going to do this presentation in Welsh, but unfortunately I couldn't find a translator, so unfortunately we can't broaden that linguistic horizon of this conference anymore, but we're doing pretty well, so it's okay. So I continue in English. First, I'd just give you a very, very brief history of where the centre comes from. This is what the centre looked like in 1973. It's a disused slate quarry in mid-Wales, so it had been abandoned. It's not used. And this is the group of people who decided to set up a community there. And their aim actually, well, I mean, they were propelled to go and set up this community by their concern for basically peak oil. They really thought that we really needed to rethink our energy systems and do things differently because we don't have this infinite amount of resources to keep us going into the future. And so they started looking at, for example, how we could decrease the amount of energy that we use. This was the first building on site, and it's actually still there today, and it's still one of the most energy efficient buildings in the UK. It's unfortunately, the walls are like this thick. And you can see the windows are very small, so it's not a very nice place to live, but it's very energy efficient. And they also looked at how to produce energy, right? So renewable sources of energy were really alternative forms of technology back in the 70s. And so they were really trialing and testing different methods of doing things. And they were trying to be self-sufficient, right? So they come from the Schumacher School of Thought. And in fact, the centre is actually part of the Schumacher Circle, together with the New Economics Foundation, Practical Action, Soil Association, etc. So in some respects, it still carries that kind of tradition. But they were looking about how to produce energy. This was one of the first wind turbines that they put up on site. And I don't know about you, but I'm quite happy that there was some sort of technological innovation over the last 40 years that CAT has run, because we are celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. But we look really, really different as a centre. And actually, some of the work that we do is quite different in terms of the perspective that we end up. So although we come from this Schumacher School of Thought, then some of the conclusions that we come to in our work kind of sit a little uncomfortably sometimes, that I'll talk through in terms of the project that I work on. So Zero Carbon Britain, we started doing this project in 2006, and we have just released our third report. So this is a project in development, and we work on a cycle of research and communication. And instead of particularly looking at peak oil, we're now, of course, concerned about climate change. This is the main issue that we look at CAT. This is our main concern. And I'm not going to go into detail, although I could, because as was introduced, I'm actually, frankly, quite depressed about the topic, which is why I now work on this project, because it's much more positive. And really, the challenge is a big one, right? We need to, in the West, certainly, move from a system where we emit large amounts of greenhouse gases to systems like this, where we emit at least net zero greenhouse gas emissions. There are some climate scientists now who say that we're at the point where we need to go further than this. So in the West, we actually need to be, in the very near future, taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, right? This is a huge challenge. So basically what we do in Zero Carbon Britain is, I'm in a practical session, but it is a theoretical project, right? It's spurning practical projects, but it's actually sort of looking at what that zero carbon future might look like. Like, how does it work? Can we actually make it function properly, and what kind of life do we live? So I'm going to call it a concrete carbon utopia, because we do all the sums, right? They all add up. So from a technical perspective, this is possible, right? So we can run the UK on net greenhouse gases. We found that at the first report, so this was back in 2007. We think we can improve our health, environment, and ways of living. This is why it's a utopian vision. I think it's a positive one. And the key is that we already have all of the technology that we need to do this, right? We don't need to innovate. We don't need to make anything new. This is really important because it means that we can start doing this now and do it quickly. And this is what it looks like. This is actually a picture that I made when I started working on the project a couple of years ago. Because of the legacy of the other report, I was basically trying to understand exactly all of the interactions in the scenario. And as you can see, it's pretty complicated, so I will try and break it down for you. This is very brief, obviously. You can read more about the project online if you're interested. The 200-page report that we wrote is free to download, so you can read it in your leisure, or if you can't be bothered with the 200 pages, we have this report in short, which is actually just 4 pages long, so it's more brief for you. So outlining the main constituents of this scenario. So how technologically does this scenario work? First, what we do what we call power down, which is actually reducing our energy consumption. And using current technology, we think we can do that in the UK to about 60%. This is maintaining a modern standard of living. And this isn't a new idea, right? Because back in 1977, CAT basically said exactly the same thing. If you look at the picture on the right, the sort of hashed thing is the government projection of our energy use in the UK. And you know they've got quite a large gauge of uncertainty, but it goes from low growth to high growth. So always growth. And CAT was saying that actually what we can do is very, very different, and we can reduce our energy demand in the UK. So that's the dashed line. And in our scenario, it's a 60% reduction. It's not exactly the same across the board, although, for example, in buildings, it does happen to be a 60% reduction. I don't think this bit is particularly exciting. I mean, it's basically insulating our buildings and turning our temperature down. It's not very sexy, but it works, right? So that's our 60% reduction in terms of buildings. In terms of transport, we can go even further. And there is a little more behaviour change in this aspect because we actually say that perhaps we just travel a little bit less. You know, we don't move around so much ourselves and we don't move goods around quite so much. And we also change the form of transport that we have. So we move from a very car-dependent individual system to perhaps using more public transport, walking and cycling. But that's only part of the story to do with travelling. And this is where technology is a real enabler in terms of reducing our energy demand. Because if you look at that 35% reduction, that's the behaviour change aspect. On the end, we've got an even bigger reduction that is basically electrifying our transport system. And that's because electric transport is so much more efficient. An electric car will go 3 or 4 times as far, given the same amount of energy as a petrol or diesel one, right? So for me, this is easy, right? This is the technological aspect. This is simple, right? Just change our systems. Then we look at how much energy we still have remaining in the system, and we say, can we produce that? Yes, we can, and we can produce it with 100% renewable resources. In fact, we have plenty in the UK. We, fortunately, live in an incredibly windy place. In fact, we have one of the best wind resources in the entire world. So wind plays a really, really big part in our renewable scenario, but we also have a suite of other renewables that sort of complement that slightly. We basically go for kind of a bit of a mix. So this is the transition from a heavily fossil fuel dependent energy situation today to that we might envisage in the future. And I just want to say something about the scale, because this is where potentially we depart from Schumacher's small is beautiful vision, because the amount of infrastructure that's required to produce even this very reduced amount of energy is massive, right? If we look at how much infrastructure is in Germany currently, right? So we all look to Germany in terms of renewables because they're doing really well, and you know, you're producing loads and loads of energy and you're installing new wind turbines and new solar panels constantly. And you know, this year, I think, what was it, 30% of the electricity came from renewables in the first 6 months. And we look at how much energy that is relative to this, and it's this. Right? So if you imagine all of the renewables that are installed in Germany currently, and we go an order of magnitude bigger. So this is a really big system. But we do have the resources there. We can do it in the UK. And this is a reliable energy system. So this is a new piece of research that we did. We built this massive model. We basically looked at how much energy we require and how much energy we produce in our scenario for every single hour over 10 years. So that's 88,000 hours. And we looked at whether they matched up, because we all know that renewables don't always produce the same amount of energy. And 83% of the time, we've got enough, right? But we have to find a solution for that 17% of the time that we don't have enough from renewables. And we have this other techno fix here, right? So we take our surplus electricity when we're producing too much, we combine it with biomass in this exciting chemical industrial process, and we basically make carbon neutral synthetic gas, which we burn in power stations when we need it. But this biomass, these sort of trees and grasses and plant-based products need land, right? We need to know where we're getting those from. But our land has other functions that we need it to serve us. So we first look at food, right? And we find that we can grow most, not entirely all, of our food for a healthy and sustainable diet in the UK, right? Using our own land. Some of the changes are done from a nutritional perspective, because currently we eat terribly in the UK. We have an absolutely appalling diet. So we make some changes from a nutritional perspective, but from a carbon and land perspective, the changes are mainly from we change from eating so much meat and dairy to plant-based protein sources. And this is really important because that transition frees up land. Because livestock, whether you're producing meat or dairy, is very, very land intensive, okay? And so if we make this transition, we can move from using, this is a depiction of roughly how much the area of land that we currently use for producing food in the UK, and we only produce 55% of our food in the UK currently. If we change our diets and reduce waste, then we can actually use much, much less land to produce much, much more of our food, right? Which means that we have some land spare for other uses. And we can use that land to grow that biomass for our energy system, so we can be self-sufficient in the UK, and we can have more space for nature. In fact, land is kind of like the key thing that pulls the whole entire scenario together. It produces food for us, it produces biomass for our energy system, and we have this last aspect, which is called carbon capture. Because using technology available today, we can't actually reduce all of our emissions in the UK to zero. We have some remaining emissions. So we use our land systems, we plant forests, we restore peatlands to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere to the same amount. So these are really, really big changes, right? But when we imagine what kind of a situation we might end up with, it probably looks something like this, right? And when I do this presentation, I do it a lot to members of the public, and everyone goes, great! We don't really have to change very much, do we? I mean, our lifestyles look pretty much the same, and they're quite happy with us, and this is good. Because they're no longer looking at this future, which is, pretty terrible. Okay, so it's not like high-tech and sci-fi and kind of cool, but it's also not what they're afraid of, which is moving backwards, right? And this is kind of comforting, because it looks very, very familiar to us. But we have an issue with this scenario, right? Because it is so focused on one aspect, it is so focused on carbon, it is so focused on a technological solution, right? Is that once people have got over this euphoria, they kind of go, well, how do we do it? This is great and everything, but how do we get there, okay? And the problem is that we don't really say. We don't have very much to say in the scenario about what the politics in that future is like, how the economy works, what the societal changes are that happen between now and then. It's very, very difficult from a scientific perspective to actually make sound judgments on these things. And I looked back at what I actually wrote in the report on this, and basically, as you can see, I came to no conclusion. I left it as an open-ended question. The how we get there is very, very important, obviously. And the how is what determines what our lives would really be like under that scenario. But we can envisage different ways of getting there. And I have no way of telling which one is more valid, right? So when I'm asked, is this a degrowth scenario? Because it's not focused on degrowth, it's focused on carbon, right? I kind of I'm the one that's confused now. And I'm learning about degrowth, so I hope we can have a really good discussion about this afterwards. And I'm trying to look for things in our scenario that give me indications, right? So I also wrote this, and I think this is degrowth, right? We have to change our focus. I think to make this scenario a reality, we have to not look at GDP growth. We have to move our focus onto solving the climate challenge, right? So we have to give up the things that, the focus that our economy currently has and move to a different focus. So I think this is part of an indication. And I think this is necessary for this kind of scenario to happen. I also kind of looked at how we were describing the kind of future that we wanted to make. So these were our aims, and I kind of went, is this the good life? I don't know. Maybe you guys have some answers to this. Perhaps it's not enough information to be able to say that. Again, subsistence, I'm not entirely clear what the definition of that is from the degrowth movement, so I'd be really interested to hear how this compared to any kind of definition you have. I think it certainly has the possibility of being a much more equal society. And that's partly because of the way that we do the modelling, right? So we do it on a per capita basis. And actually, not our work, but other people's work has taken how much energy we use, how many resources we use, how much land we use, what kind of land we use per capita, and multiplied it up to a global population. And this standard of living is possible for everybody in the world. But again, the key is in the how, right? How we do it. And also, we don't say anything about any of these things, which are the things that I've been hearing. Okay, so we say a little bit potentially about productivity, but we don't explicitly state any of these things in this scenario. And these are really sort of seem to be key and seem to be very important in the degrowth movement. And when we talk about degrowth technologies, again, I'm really sorry, but I'm finding it very, very difficult to know whether or not a degrowth technology is even a thing. You know, like, I think it sounds as though there is quite a lot of disagreement going on here. But I'm going to look, as was suggested in this presentation, at the rules and assumptions that we make. And basically, I'm going to go through a really, really poor analysis of whether or not I think our rules and assumptions are compatible with degrowth. And I would really, really like to hear what you think, because I'm learning about this, and I'm not entirely sure that I've got this right, okay? But I'm just going to go and make one point, which is that we were 6 people working on this research project, right? We are all environmentalists. We all work for a charity organisation, part-time, not for good big wages. Therefore, we feel like we need meaningfulness in our work, right? We do this because we think it's important and it's necessary to be done, right? As a result, we have to change lots of aspects of our lifestyles. So we're kind of, I guess, living that a little bit already. But still, out of a 12-month research project, we spent 3 months disagreeing about rules and assumptions for our scenario, okay? So we're really similar people with very, very similar aims and aspirations, but we couldn't agree on what these rules and assumptions were. And I think this is important, because they're the things that really make a difference in how your scenario looks, right? What kind of future you have. So this is what we ended up with. And I'm going to say the first one, that is coherent with degrowth. You know, we don't need new innovation. We've got everything we need. The second one I'm kind of question marking, because I think it's probably more to do with ownership models, or what kind of, whether they're localized production of renewable energy, or whether we have, like massive offshore wind farms. Again, I'm questioning geoengineering. I think, again, it does go with an only proven technology, so it's kind of degrowth, but also we use natural systems for carbon capture, right? So it's about how we grow those natural systems. Do we put a value on them so that people start, planting more forests, or do we just do it because we think forests are really great? The how is really important here. In terms of our assumptions, I think from the keynote that we heard yesterday, I'm just going to say yes to the first one, because if we do this, if we decarbonise very quickly, then we give space to other people in the world to be able to do things slightly differently, okay? Bit confused about population increase. I don't really have the answers. Household occupation stays the same in our scenario. I think that says that we build fewer buildings, so potentially that is degrowth. Size of industry remains the same. So we actually produce probably very different things in our scenario. We don't go into explicit detail, but it's more of a steady state. It's not getting smaller. And we assume that everyone would like things to remain the same today where possible, right? It's not possible. We have to make changes to our diet, to how much we travel, etc., what we do with our homes. Our work-life balance potentially is in there somewhere, but it's not explicit. But this is, degrowth says that we change our society and we change our culture, so I don't think this is compatible. Cost is not an issue for us. Basically, we don't go for the most expensive technologies ever if we've got the choice of something a bit cheaper. But most of these things are ridiculously expensive, and we just choose to ignore that. We say, if it's really, really important for us to deal with climate change, then we have to find the money, right? So this isn't an issue for us. I can also look at what comes out of the model, okay, and try and do exactly the same thing. So all these things are basically less. We're producing and using less energy, less food. We have a more local, although it doesn't necessarily mean in your backyard, food production. We travel less, use less land overall. We can curtail our energy generation, so we actually produce too much electricity sometimes, and we say it's okay to actually just turn those wind farms off if we don't need the energy, right? Which goes against how all of our systems work currently. And there is an indication that the consumption of goods likely decreases, right? But we're not too explicit about that. Things that are not degrowth. It requires a large-scale investment. I would really appreciate some discussion on this because I'm not sure whether I'm even sort of classifying this right. There is large-scale agribusiness, so we need the high yields that come from technological agriculture, from inputs that we put into the soil. The system doesn't work because we're trying to use as little land as possible, right? The system doesn't work if we use, for example, organic farming techniques across the board. It's very, very large-scale technology, right? And there's a trade-off with resource use. So if we don't use the really, really big wind turbines, then we have to use disproportionately more smaller ones. So we need more resources if we have a more potentially localized distribution of our energy infrastructure. There is potential for industrialization of the landscape, right? So we are installing a lot of wind farms.
Alice, you have just one more minute, please.
Okay. And the resource uses, obviously, it's phenomenal, right? We are building so much infrastructure. There is enough resource there to do it, globally, for everybody, but it will require more extraction than we're doing currently. So I kind of don't really know what to do with this now, so I make a score, okay? So I say, we've got 7 things that are not degrowth, and we've got 11 things that are degrowth, and I go, great, so it's probably, on average, like a degrowth scenario, right? It's very difficult to be like super happy at like 2 o'clock in the morning. But actually, I think my conclusion is this, right? Perhaps our scenario is internally inconsistent. It is a theoretical future, and actually, if we were to play this out, if we were to try and work towards this, we wouldn't end up with this scenario, right? We'd end up with something that was quite different. And that's kind of okay, because it's just a proof of concept, right? It's proof that we can actually technically do this, and I'm happy for the future to be different from this. But I would actually really enjoy if any of you could help input into potentially the next zero-carbon Britain to try and make it more internally coherent, and to try and see how we build degrowth in from the bottom. Because in my work, when I talk to people about decarbonisation scenarios, when I look at all of the ones that everybody else does, then I can't find a single one, and this is probably obvious to all of you, but I can't find a single one that is based or has any influence from current economics of growth that actually in the Western world in which we live manages to go anywhere near dealing with climate change. Right? So this is really important. And thank you very much for listening.